The forge had belonged to her father before it belonged to grief. Rowena Marsh had grown up with the smell of hot iron, the way other girls grew up with the smell of bread. Coal smoke and burning metal had soaked into the walls of the Marsh family workshop in Harwick, Pennsylvania, permanently, completely without apology. She could not remember a morning that had not begun with the sound of her father's hammer finding iron, and she could not imagine a morning that ever would. But that was before the coughing started. It began the winter Rowena turned 19. A small cough, the kind that comes with cold air and goes away with warm soup. Her father, Edmund Marsh, waved it off with the same large hand that had guided her first grip on a hammer when she was 7 years old. He was a man built like the work he did, wide through the shoulders, thick in the forearm, unhurried in his movements. He did not believe in making much of small troubles. The trouble did not stay small. By the following winter, the cough had become something with weight to it, something that bent him forward over the anvil on bad mornings and stole the color from his face. By the third winter, Rowena was doing most of the work herself, not because her father asked her to, because she could see what was coming the way you can see a storm gathering on a flat horizon long before the first drop of rain hits the ground. Edmund Marsh died in the spring of 1883 when the dogwood trees were just beginning to show white along the hillsides outside Harwick. He died the way he had lived, quietly without complaint, in the small bedroom above the forge that smelled permanently of coal and iron. Rowena sat beside him through the last night and held his hand, which was still rough and hard even in those final hours, and she did not cry until after he was gone. She had learned that from him too. You finish the work first, then you feel what you feel. The debts came with the funeral. Debts came with, she had not known the full shape of them until the lawyer spread the papers across the kitchen table 2 days after they put Edmund in the ground. Medical bills from the last year and a half, a loan against the property taken out 2 winters back when the work had slowed and the bills had not. The forge itself, the building, the equipment, all of it was collateral. The lawyer was not unkind about it. He simply explained in the flat, careful way that lawyers explain things, that there was not enough left to cover what was owed. Rowena sat across from him with her hands folded in her lap and listened to every word. She was 22 years old. She had broad shoulders and thick forearms and hands that were already calloused in the particular way of someone who has worked with tools from childhood. She was tall for a woman, nearly 5 feet 8 inches, and she carried herself with the straight-back steadiness of a person who has spent years standing over an anvil. She was not beautiful in the way that Harwick considered beautiful. She was not soft or small or decorative. She knew this. She had always known this, the way you know a fact about the weather or the distance between two towns. It was simply true, and she had never spent much time arguing with things that were simply true. What she had spent her time on was the work. And now the work was gone. The forge sold in 3 days. There were 2 buyers interested, and the one with more money won, and that was the end of the Marsh family smoothie that Edmund had built with his own hands 26 years before. Rowena packed what she could carry into a single traveling case: her mother's Bible, 3 dresses, her father's first hammer, which she wrapped carefully in oilcloth and wedged in along the side. She left everything else behind because she had nowhere to take it. She was sitting in their front room of the Harwick boarding house on the 3rd evening after the sale when she found the advertisement. It was in the back pages of a newspaper that someone had left on the common room table, folded open to the classified notices. She almost did not read it. She had been looking at the room around her, clean, plain, temporary, and thinking about what came next, which was a question that kept arriving without an answer. She could find work as a seamstress, she supposed, though she was not particularly skilled at it. She could hire herself out as a laundress. She could do domestic work in someone else's house. These were the options available to a woman in her situation in Harwick, Pennsylvania in the spring of 1883, and not one of them felt like anything other than a slow disappearance. The advertisement was 4 lines long. Seeking a wife. Fairfax, California. Prosperous ranch owner requires a woman of strong character, willing to work, capable of building a life in the American West. Correspondence welcomed. A. Crane, Silver Creek Ranch. Rowena read it twice, then she read the specific words again. Strong character, willing to work, capable of building a life. Not gentle, not refined, not accomplished in music or needlework. The advertisement was asking for something she actually was describing, qualities she actually possessed, as if those qualities were desirable rather than unfortunate. She sat with that for a long moment. She had never considered herself someone who made impulsive decisions. Edmund Marsh had raised her to think things through, to look at a piece of iron and understand what it needed before you put it to the flame. But there are moments when thinking too long becomes its own kind of cowardice, when the careful consideration of options is really just a way of staying still while the world moves on without you. Rowena went to the writing desk in the corner of the room and wrote a reply that same evening. The letters that came back from California to Amaniautra over the following 6 weeks were unlike anything she had expected. She had prepared herself for something practical. A list of requirements, perhaps. A description of duties. The kind of correspondence you might receive from a prospective employer rather than a prospective husband. What she received instead were pages that surprised her, careful, thoughtful, written in a hand that was sometimes uneven, but always deliberate, as if the author chose each word slowly and meant it fully. The man who wrote those letters described California the way someone describes a place they genuinely love: the quality of the light in the foothills in the early morning, the particular green of the Sierra Nevada slopes in spring, the sound of cattle moving across open ground at first light. He wrote about what he respected in a person: steadiness, honesty, the willingness to do hard things without making much of the hardship. He wrote that he believed strength in a woman was not a flaw to be overlooked, but a quality to be valued, that a man who thought otherwise was a fool who deserved the soft and useless life he was building for himself. Rowena read those letters so many times that she could have recited passages from memory. She wrote back honestly about her father, about the forge, about the fact that she was not delicate and never had been, and was not going to pretend otherwise. She described her hands. She described what she could do. She said plainly that she was coming to California to build something real, and that she needed a partner in that, not a keeper. The reply came back in 10 days. "You are exactly what I have been looking for." She bought the train ticket the following morning. The journey from Pennsylvania to California took 11 days. Rowena sat by the window for most of it and watched the country change. The green hills of the east gave way to the flat, enormous middle of the continent, which gave way in turn to the dry, gold, and brown immensity of the west. She had never been west of Ohio. The scale of it was something she had no frame of reference for: the distances, the sky, the way the land ran on, until it seemed to meet the horizon without any edge or boundary. It was not comfortable exactly, but it was honest. There was nothing in that landscape that was trying to be smaller than it was. She thought about the letters often during those 11 days. She thought about the man who had written them, who had used the word strength as if it were a compliment, who had described the California foothills with such particular affection that she could almost see the morning light in them. She thought about what it might be like to arrive somewhere and have that be true, to be seen from the beginning as something worth seeing. By the time the train pulled into Fairfax on a bright Wednesday morning in late September of 1883, Rowena Marsh had not exactly allowed herself to hope, but she had allowed herself to be open to it, which was not something she had permitted in a long time. She stepped off the train onto the platform with her traveling case in her left hand. She recognized him immediately, not because she had any description to go by, but because of the way he stood, a man of perhaps 50 broad through the chest, but soft in a way that suggested the softnesses had come on gradually, replacing something harder that had been there before. He was well dressed for a Wednesday morning in a California railroad town, which meant he wanted to be looked at. His hat was good quality. His boots were good quality. He held himself with the particular posture of a man who expected the world to arrange itself around his comfort. Aldous Crane. He was looking at her. She could see the moment his face shifted, the polished expectancy of it giving way to something else. Something that was not quite disgust and not quite confusion, but lived in the territory between them. She watched his eyes move over her, the shoulders, the arms beneath her traveling coat, the straight-backed, unhurried way she carried herself, and the case that she was carrying without any visible effort. He turned to the smaller man standing beside him and said something. She was still 10 feet away, moving through the thin crowd on the platform, and she heard every word with perfect clarity. "That is not what I ordered." The smaller man said nothing. Crane said it again, louder, as if the first time had not quite satisfied him. "That is not what I ordered. Look at her. That is no kind of woman." Rowena stopped walking. She stood on that platform in the bright California morning with her traveling case in her hand and let the words land where they landed. Around her, the ordinary sounds of a train platform continued, someone calling out the hiss and settle of the engine boots on wood. A woman near the far end of the platform had gone very still watching. A man in a canvas jacket had turned to look. In 22 years, no one had ever said it quite like that. Not out loud, not in the open air in front of strangers with the flat certainty of a man reading a receipt that has come back wrong. She had heard the whispers in Harwick. She knew what they called her behind their hands. But whispers are whispers. They live in corners and require some courage to repeat. What Aldous Crane had just said required no courage at all. It had the easy contempt of a man who had never once considered that the person he was talking about could hear him. She could hear him. She stood still for one full breath. Two, then she bent down and set her traveling case on the platform boards with a careful, deliberate movement. She straightened. She picked it up again, this time with her right hand, and she walked off the platform in a direction that was not toward Aldous Crane, without looking back, without hurrying, without giving anyone watching the satisfaction of seeing her face. She did not cry. She had learned that from Edmund. You finish the work first. The town of Kfax was not large. It sat in a shallow valley in the California foothills, the kind of place that existed because people needed supplies and services and had agreed more or less to gather in one spot to exchange them. There was a main street with the necessary buildings: general store, hardware merchant, land office, two saloons, a church at the eastern end, a small hotel in the middle. The surrounding country was cattle and mining land, golden brown in September, with the Sierra Nevada rising dark blue in the distance to the east. Rowena walked the length of the main street once and paid attention. She had grown up in a town not entirely unlike this one, though smaller. She knew how to read a town, what it needed, what it had, what was missing. She stopped in front of a building that stood dark and padlocked near the north end of the street. A wooden sign above the door, weathered but legible. Blacksmith. Through the small window beside the door, she could see the shape of an anvil, a cold forge tools hanging on the far wall in the particular organized disorder of a working smithy. She found the hardware merchant 2 doors down and asked him about it. The blacksmith had died 3 weeks ago, the merchant told her. Old Harmon, a good man, a fair worker. The town had been making do since sending horses to the next settlement, for shoeing, managing with what they had. Nobody had come forward to take over the shop. The building was owned by the town, leased out to whoever ran the smithy. Is the mayor in town today? Rowena asked. The merchant looked at her, the way people in Kfax would look at her for the next several months, with a mix of assessment and uncertainty, trying to fit what they were seeing into a category they already had. He's in the land office most mornings, the merchant said. Rowena thanked him and walked to the land office. Mayor Elias Pruitt was a thin man of 60, with a gray mustache and the tired eyes of someone who had been solving other people's problems for a long time. He listened to what Rowena proposed with his hands folded on his desk and his expression giving nothing away. She laid it out plainly. She had trained as a blacksmith under her father in Pennsylvania. She could do the work: horseshoeing, wagon repair tool, making whatever the town and the surrounding ranches required. She would lease the shop on the same terms as the previous tenant, paying from the first month's revenue rather than up front, because she had arrived in Kfax with less cash than she had intended to have. She did not explain why. She did not tell him about the platform or Aldous Crane. That was not his business, and it was not relevant. Pruitt was quiet for a long moment after she finished. You understand, he said carefully, that this is not the kind of work. I understand that your town doesn't have a blacksmith, Rowena said. I understand that the closest working smithy is 14 miles east. I understand that it is September and ranches in this county have horses that need shoeing before winter and wagons that need work before the hard weather comes. I can do that work. I have been doing it since I was 12 years old. She put her hands on his desk, palms down. He looked at them. He was quiet again. A man who had spent decades making practical decisions looked at 2 hands that told a practical story. The calluses were in the right places. The scars were the right kind. The fingers bore the specific thickening that came from years of hammerwork and nothing else. First month's revenue, he said. Full amount, not half. Agreed. He slid a key across the desk without another word. She spent the first afternoon cleaning. Old Harmon had been a tidy worker, which helped. The forge itself was in good condition, the fire pot clean, the bellows functional, the tools well maintained. She reorganized what needed reorganizing, took stock of the coal supply, and the iron stock, tested the bellows, checked the vise and the slack tub and the quench barrel. She worked through the afternoon and into the early evening, and when she was done, she stood in the center of the forge and breathed in the cold smell of old coal and iron. It smelled like home, not like the specific home in Harwick that was now gone, like something older than that, like the idea of home as a place where you know how to be, where the tools fit your hands and the work makes sense and you understand bone deep what you are doing and why. She slept that first night on a cot she had borrowed from the hotel in the small back room of the forge. The mountain air came through the single window, and the stars outside were enormous and close. The way stars get in high country, where the air is clear and there is nothing between you and the sky. She was still in KFAX. She had not gone home. The first week was slow, as first weeks in new places always are. Word moved through KFAX, the way word moves in small towns, not fast but completely, until everyone has heard it and formed an opinion before they have seen the evidence. The opinion in KFAX, or the opinion that Mrs. Dorothea Whitmore voiced loudly enough to become the town's official position, was that this was highly irregular and probably nothing good would come of it. Mrs. Whitmore was a widow of 60 who had been the social center of KFAX for 15 years and who understood her authority in the town the way a river understands its banks as something natural and proper and not to be questioned. She was not cruel exactly. She simply had very clear ideas about how the world should be arranged, and a woman running a blacksmith shop did not fit comfortably into any of those arrangements. It is not, Mrs. Whitmore told anyone who would listen, what is done. Aldous Crane avoided the subject entirely, which in KFAX amounted to a statement of its own. He was a man whose opinions carried weight among the ranching families, and his silence on the matter of Rowena Marsh was understood to mean disapproval without the inconvenience of having to defend it. Rowena heard all of this in pieces and fragments through the ordinary conduct of life in a small town. She heard it and let it pass through her without stopping, the way you let cold wind pass through when you are working near a fire. She had grown up understanding that the world had very specific ideas about what she should be, and that those ideas had nothing to do with what she actually was, and that arguing with them directly was a waste of time and energy better spent on the work. So she worked. She opened the forge at first light every morning and kept it running until the last of the day's light was gone. The first customers came cautiously in the way people approach something unfamiliar. Not with hostility exactly, but with the careful reserve of people who have not yet decided what they think. A ranch hand brought in a broken trace chain. A farmer needed a wheel rim repaired. She did the work well, charged fair prices, and said little beyond what the job required. The work was good. It had always been good. That was the thing about learning a trade from someone who genuinely knew. The quality lives in your hands, in the specific weight of the hammer and the exact angle of the blow, in the way you know by the color of the iron where it is in its temperature and what it needs next. Edmund Marsh had taught her all of it with the same patient, thorough attention he gave to everything, and she had learned it completely the way you learn something when you are young and paying close attention, and the person teaching you does not believe in doing things halfway. By the end of the first week, she had more work than she had started with. By the end of the second week, she was busy. He came on a Thursday morning in that second week. She heard the horse before she saw the man, the particular uneven quality of a horse moving carefully, favoring one foot. She looked up from the wagon axle she was straightening and saw him come through the open doors of the forge leading a gray horse that was clearly trying to keep weight off its right front leg. The man was perhaps 25 or 26. He was not large in the way that draws attention, not the theatrical size of a man who wants to be noticed, but solid through the shoulders and easy in his movements, the kind of ease that comes from years of physical work and not from any effort to appear relaxed. His face was sun-darkened and direct, with light gray-blue eyes that caught the morning light coming through the forge doors. His clothes were working clothes, worn but well kept. His hat was plain. His boots were practical. He led the horse to the center of the forge and stopped. "Lost a shoe about 2 miles back," he said. "He's carrying it well, but I didn't want to push him." Rowena set down her hammer and came to look. She ran her hand down the horse's right foreleg, checking for heat and swelling before she went to the hoof. The horse shifted slightly and then stilled, and she moved through the examination with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has done this enough times that the horse's comfort is simply part of the calculation. She checked the remaining 3 shoes while she was at it, noting the wear pattern worn. "He's been working hard," she said. "These other 3 are getting close." "He has been," the man said. She went to her stock of prepared shoes, selected the right size, gathered her tools. She worked without commentary, finding the right fit, trimming the hoof, bringing the shoe to heat, and shaping it to match. The horse stood patient under her hands. The man stood quiet near the doors. She was used to being watched while she worked. She had developed a specific awareness of it, the sideways glance, the uncomfortable shifting the look that said, "This is not how this is supposed to go." She had cataloged all the varieties of that look over the past 2 weeks, and she knew them by detail and expression. This was not that look. He was simply watching the work the way you watch something that interests you, with attention and without discomfort, the way a craftsman watches another craftsman doing something well. She drove the last nail home and lowered the hoof and stood. He was looking at her directly. "You do good work," he said. She waited for the rest of it. The "for a woman," the "I'm surprised," the slight awkward pivot that people made when they realized they had said something complimentary and wanted to find a way to take part of it back. It did not come. "My father was a metal worker," he said. "Not a smith. He worked with lighter materials, fittings, and mechanisms mostly. But he knew the trade well enough that he taught me what good work looks like." He paused, looking at the shoes she had just set. "That's good work." "I'll check the others next time you're in," Rowena said. "They've got another few weeks, but not many more than that." He nodded. He reached into his coat for payment, and she told him the amount, and he paid without discussion, which she appreciated. He had turned to lead the horse toward the doors when he stopped and looked back at her over his shoulder. The morning light was coming in from the east, the early sharp light of a California autumn morning, and it was falling full across her working clothes and her leather apron, and the arms she had rolled her sleeves back from, because you did not work a forge with fabric near the heat. She knew what she looked like. She had always known what she looked like. He looked at her for a moment that was neither short nor long. "Strong is beautiful on you," he said. Then he led the horse out into the morning and was gone. Rowena stood in the center of her forge with her hammer at her side and the smell of hot iron around her and the morning light coming in through the open doors. She had been called many things in 22 years. Strong, yes, but always as an apology, always as a qualification. Strong but not quite right. Strong and unfortunately so. Strong for a woman, which meant strong the way a draft horse is strong, which is useful, but not something you would call beautiful. She had never not once heard those 2 words placed together and aimed at her. "Strong is beautiful on you." She stood there for a long moment in the silence after he left, and she felt something shift in her chest. Something small and careful, like a door she had stopped noticing, had been opened the smallest amount, letting in a thin line of light from the other side. Then she put her hammer down on the bench and went back to the wagon axle. She finished the work first. That was what you did. His name was Wade Calloway. She learned this from Hattie Jensen, the hardware merchant's daughter, who was one of the few people in Kfax who had been straightforwardly kind to Rowena since her arrival. Not effusively kind, not the performance of kindness, but the simple practical warmth of a person who decides early that they like someone and acts accordingly. "He works up at Silver Creek," Hattie told her, sweeping the step in front of her father's store while Rowena picked up supplies. "Has done for about 2 years now. Good with horses, good with cattle. Doesn't say much, but what he says he means." She gave Rowena a sideways look with a small smile in it. "Why do you ask?" "I don't ask many questions," Rowena said, which was true. Hattie's smile widened slightly. She swept in silence for a moment. "He came back in yesterday," she said, "after he left your place. Bought feed from my father. Asked sort of offhand how the new smithy was working out." Another pause. "I told him it was working out well." Rowena picked up her supplies and thanked her and walked back to the forge. She thought about what Hattie had said for the rest of the afternoon, in the way that you think about something by trying not to think about it, circling it without landing, keeping it at the edge of attention without bringing it to the center. She was not a woman who had spent much time imagining her future. She had been too occupied with the present, with the immediate and concrete demands of the work, to spend much energy on anything as uncertain as hope. Hope required a willingness to be disappointed, and Rowena had protected herself from disappointment for a long time by simply not expecting much beyond what she could produce with her own hands. But that evening, after she had banked the forge and cleaned her tools and washed the day's work from her arms, she sat outside the forge door in the last of the September light and looked at the mountains going dark against the eastern sky. She was still in Kfax. She had not gone home. And for the first time since her father's death, she was not entirely sure that home was a thing you went back to. Maybe it was a thing you built. Maybe it was a thing you built in a place you chose with your own hands, starting with whatever materials were available. The mountains darkened. The first stars appeared. Somewhere north of town, a coyote called once and was answered, and then the valley went quiet again. Rowena Marsh sat outside her forge in Kfax, California, on a September evening in 1883, and she breathed in the cold mountain air, and she thought about a man with gray-blue eyes who had watched her work without looking away. She thought about 6 words. Strong is beautiful on you. She sat with them for a long time in the way you sit with something that you are not ready to put down, but are not sure yet what to do with. In the way you sit with something that might be the beginning of something. The night settled around her. She went inside. The forge would need stoking early tomorrow. There was work to do. October came to Kfax the way it comes to the California foothills, not with the dramatic collapse of summer that Rowena had known in Pennsylvania, but with a gradual cooling, a deepening of the light, the mornings arriving sharper and the evenings pulling in earlier, until one day you notice that the hills have gone from gold to amber, and the air carries something in it that was not there before. Rowena noticed all of it from the forge doors. She had developed the habit of leaving them open as long as the light lasted, partly for ventilation, and partly because she had discovered that the open doors changed something about the way people related to her work. A closed forge was a private thing, a thing happening behind a door that you had to choose to approach. An open forge was a public thing visible from the street part of the town, rather than separate from it. People walking past would slow. Some would stop. A few would come in to look, then find some small piece of work they needed done, then come back again the following week. The work had grown steadily through October. Not dramatically. Not in the way of a triumph or a vindication. Just a steady, quiet accumulation of a business that does what it promises. The Wilson family, bringing their wagon in after the rear axle cracked on the North Road, the 3 ranch hands from the Beaumont spread, who needed horses shod before the fall roundup, the assayer's office requiring a new set of door hinges after the old ones finally gave out. Job by job, day by day, the ledger moved in the right direction. Mrs. Whitmore still crossed the street when she saw Rowena coming. Aldous Crane still gave no public opinion, which was its own kind of opinion. But the work was there, and the work was good, and Rowena had learned long ago that good work was the only argument worth making. You did not persuade people with words. You persuaded them with what you built and fixed and made functional again. You persuaded them with quality and reliability in the simple, undeniable fact of a thing done well. She was persuading them slowly. Wade Calloway came back on the 3rd Thursday of October. He came with the gray horse and 2 others from Silver Creek, all 3 needing their shoes checked, 1 needing a full reset. He led them in without ceremony and tied them to the hitching rail inside the forge doors and stood back the same way he had stood back the first time, with his arms crossed loosely and his attention on the work. They talked while she worked, not constantly, not in the way of people filling silence, because silence makes them uncomfortable, but in the way of 2 people who are both comfortable with quiet and speak when they have something worth saying. He told her about Silver Creek Ranch, the size of it, the quality of the cattle, the particular challenges of the terrain in the foothills east of Kfax, where the land folded and broke in ways that made driving cattle harder than it looked on flat ground. He talked about horses with specific technical affection, as if each animal was a problem worth solving carefully. She told him about Pennsylvania, about the forge in Harwick, about her father who had believed that any skill worth having was worth teaching completely, without shortcuts or omissions to whoever had the aptitude to learn it. He taught you everything, Wade asked. Everything he knew, Rowena said. She was driving nails into the 3rd horse's left rear shoe, 3 clean strikes each. He said I had better hands for it than most men he'd trained. He didn't say it to be kind. He said it because it was true, and he didn't see the point of pretending otherwise. Wade was quiet for a moment. He sounds like a good man, he said. He was the best man I knew, Rowena said. And that was all she said about it, and Wade did not press, and she was grateful for that in the specific way You are grateful when someone understands without being told that a door is closed. When the work was done and the horses were ready, he paid and stood by the doors for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. I'll be back next week, he said. We've got 4 more that need looking at before the hard weather. I'll be here, she said. He left. Rowena turned back to the forge and stood there for a moment with her hands on the edge of the anvil, feeling the familiar weight of it under her palms. She was aware of something happening, something gradual and careful like iron coming slowly to temperature. Not dramatic, not the sudden blaze of a forge fire catching. More like the slow, even build of heat through a piece of metal that is being brought to working temperature properly without rushing. She went back to work. He came the following week and the week after that. Sometimes he came with ranch horses that genuinely needed attention. Sometimes the horses needed less than he seemed to think they did, and she suspected he knew it too, and neither of them said anything about it. They had settled into something that was not yet a courtship and not simply a business arrangement, something in between occupying the careful territory where two people who are both naturally cautious begin to understand that they are interested in the same direction without quite saying so yet. He helped when he could make it natural, holding a horse that was being difficult, pumping the bellows when her third hand would have been useful, fetching things from the supplier shelves without being asked when it was obvious what she needed next. He never made a show of helping. He simply did what was useful and let her do the rest. She appreciated it in a way she did not say. She thought he knew anyway. It was Hattie Jensen who told her about the legal threat. They were at the general store on a Saturday morning in late October, the first cold Saturday of the season, the air outside carrying the real bite of coming winter. Hattie was helping her father behind the counter, and Rowena was going through her supply list when Hattie leaned forward and dropped her voice in the way she always did when she had something important to say. I thought you should know, Hattie said, before you heard it somewhere else. Rowena looked up from her list. Hattie told her. Aldous Crane had been visiting the land office and the lawyer's office with increasing frequency over the past 2 weeks. The subject of those visits, as best as Hattie had been able to gather from her father, who had heard it from the land office clerk, who had heard it from the lawyer's secretary, was the mail order bride agreement, the specific contract that governed the arrangement between Rowena and Crane. The contract that had brought her to K-Fax and that she had assumed after the scene at the platform was simply void. It was not simply void. Crane's position was that Rowena had received transportation and advance expenses under the terms of the agreement and had not fulfilled her obligations under it. He was exploring whether he could use this to recover those costs, which at the going rate for a cross-country rail ticket, plus the various fees associated with a mail order arrangement, amounted to more money than Rowena had in the world. Not enough money to ruin her, but enough money to make leaving impossible. And leaving, Rowena understood immediately, was the point, not the money. Aldous Crane did not need the money. What he needed was for Rowena Marsh to not be in K-Fax anymore, because Rowena Marsh in K-Fax, running her own business, doing good work, slowly building the respect of the people who had watched him reject her at the train platform, was a standing correction to everything he believed about the natural order of things. She stood at the general store counter for a long moment after Hattie finished. Thank you, she said. What will you do? Hattie asked. I'll think about it, Rowena said. Then I'll decide. She paid for her supplies and walked back to the forge in the cold October morning, and she let herself feel for exactly as long as it took to walk those 2 blocks. The full weight of it, the unfairness of it, the particular exhaustion of a world that kept finding new ways to tell you that you did not belong in the place you had chosen to stand. She felt it completely, all of it, walking those 2 blocks. Then she went into the forge and banked the fire and went to work. The first week of November, the work started drying up. Not all at once. Gradually, the way water recedes so slowly that you are not certain at first if it is actually happening or if you are imagining it. The Wilson family sent word that they would be handling their own repairs for a while. The Beaumont Ranch hands did not come back for the follow-up shoeing she had told them they would need. 2 jobs she had been expecting, based on conversations from the previous month, did not materialize. She watched it happen and kept her own counsel. She was not naive about what was behind it. A word in the right ears from the right person was all it would take in a town the size of K-Fax to change the direction of business without anyone having to say anything directly or do anything that could be pointed to. Aldous Crane was a man who had the right ears available to him, who had spent years building the kind of social capital in the ranching community that he could spend on something like this without appearing to do anything at all. She could not prove it. She was not the kind of person who needed to prove everything before she allowed herself to understand it. She had grown up learning to read heat by color. You did not wait for the iron to tell you what it needed with words. You watched it. You read it. You understood what was happening before the evidence became obvious. She understood what was happening. She kept working. She opened the forge every morning, and she did the work that came, and she kept her prices fair and her quality high, and she said nothing about what she understood to anyone except Hattie. And even to Hattie, she said only the facts and not the feelings. But the feelings were there. She was not made of iron, whatever people seemed to think. It was on a Tuesday evening in the second week of November that it caught her. The last customer had left at mid-afternoon. She had done it what small work remained, mending a cracked hinge, sharpening 3 blades that someone had left without instructions tidying the coal supply. By the time the light was fully gone, the forge had been quiet for 4 hours, and the silence of it had a different quality than the ordinary silence of an evening after good work. It was the silence of too much space and not enough in it. She sat on the stool beside the anvil with her hands in her lap. The forge was banked, the tools clean, the shop in order. Everything that could be done had been done. There was nothing left to attend to that would give her a reason not to think. So she thought. She thought about Pennsylvania, about the train platform, and the lawyer's papers spread across the kitchen table, and the feeling of arriving at a decision because all the alternatives had been removed. She thought about the advertisement in the back of the newspaper, strong character, willing to work, capable of building a life, in the letters that had come back, the careful, thoughtful letters that had made her feel for the first time as if the qualities she possessed were the right qualities, as if the person she was happened to be the person someone was looking for. She thought about what it meant to have traveled 2,000 miles towards something that had dissolved the moment she arrived, about what it meant to have remade herself in this town, to have done the work and earned a place here, to have laid the foundation of something real, only to feel it being quietly dismantled by a man who had decided from 10 feet away at a train platform that she was not worth the trouble of being fair to. She put her hands flat on her thighs and looked at the dark forge. Was the world right? The thought came in quietly, the way the most dangerous thoughts always come. Not with the force of a blow, but with the patient persistence of water finding its way through stone. She had been arguing with the world's assessment of her for 22 years, and she was tired, and the tiredness was showing her the question from an angle she did not usually allow. What if the town was right? What if the work was not enough? What if there was something genuinely wrong about who she was and what she was in the place she was trying to occupy? She sat with that for a long time in the cold dark of the forge, looking at it from all sides, testing the weight of it, trying to understand whether the problem was with the iron or with her assessment of it. She was still sitting there when she heard boots on the forge floor. She had not heard him approach. Wade Calloway was not a man who moved quietly by intention. He simply moved the way he did everything without unnecessary noise, his attention on what mattered rather than on the impression he was making. He stopped a few feet inside the doors. The forge was dark except for the faint glow of the banked coals, and he would have seen her only as a shape on the stool, a woman sitting alone in a dark smithy at 7 in the evening. Not working, not moving, just sitting. "Rowena," he said. She did not stand. "I'm not open." "I know." He did not leave. "I heard what Crane is doing. Word got to me today." He paused. "I wanted to come by." She was quiet. "I can talk to some of the ranchers," he said. "The ones at Silver Creek have always liked your work. I can put in a word with the garrison spread north of town. They have been meaning to come in. I can make sure people know us." The word came out harder than she intended. She stood up from the stool and turned to face him, and she could feel the shape of her own anger, which had been sitting under the tiredness this whole evening and was now presenting itself clearly. "I don't need you to go out and make sure people know things, Wade. I don't need you to speak for me with the ranchers or put in words on my behalf or arrange the situation so that it comes out better for me." He was still in the doorway. His expression in the dim light was careful listening. "I need people to believe I can do the work," she said. "Not because you told them to, because I've shown them. There's a difference between those two things, and the difference matters to me." She stopped. She was aware of her own voice in the quiet of the dark forge, and she brought it back down. I know you mean well. I know exactly what you mean by it. But I don't need a man standing between me and this town vouching for me like I'm a horse he's recommending. I've been doing the work. The work should be enough. Wade was quiet for a moment. You're right, he said. She had not expected that. You're right, he said again. That's not what you need. That's what I wanted to offer, which is different. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the doorframe post. I'm sorry for not thinking it through better before I said it. He turned to go. And then because the honesty of it stopped her, she said, Wade. He turned back. I know you meant it well, she said. That's not nothing. He stood there for a moment in the forge doorway with the cold night air behind him. I know, he said quietly. Good night, Rowena. He walked out into the dark and was gone. Rowena stood in the middle of the forge and listened to his footsteps fade, and then the silence of facts at night settle back in round her. She felt the specific, particular loneliness of having sent away someone who meant well, because what they offered was the wrong shape, and being right to do it and having that rightness provide absolutely no comfort whatsoever. She went to bed late. She did not sleep well. 7 days passed, the longest 7 days since she had arrived in Kfax. Not because they were eventful. In fact, they were the opposite of eventful. She worked her reduced schedule. She spoke to customers when there were customers. She ate supper alone and banked the forge and slept and woke and did it again. Hattie came by twice and said nothing about Wade, and Rowena said nothing about Wade, and they talked about other things, which was a kindness on Hattie's part that Rowena recognized and appreciated without saying so. She thought about that night in the forge more than she wanted to. Not about what she had said, which she still believed was right, but about the way he had listened, the way he had stood there in the dark and taken the full force of what she said without deflecting or defending or finding a way to make her feel small for saying it. The way he had said, you're right, as if he meant it, as if her correction was not an embarrassment to him but simply a fact that adjusted his understanding. She had never in her life had a disagreement with a man that ended with him saying, you're right, and meaning it. She thought about that more than she meant to. Wade came back on the 8th day, not with horses, not with any stated reason. He simply appeared at the forge doors in the late afternoon, hat in hand, and stood there until she looked up from the wheel rim she was straightening. I've been thinking about what you said, he told her. All right, she said and kept working. You were right that the difference matters. Between people believing in you because the work earned it versus because someone told them to. He was quiet for a moment. I understand that now better than I did. She set down her hammer and looked at him. What I should have said that night, Wade continued, was that I believe in you, not because I think you need me to, but because it's true and I thought you ought to know it. He met her eyes steadily. I believe you're going to be all right, Rowena. I believed it from the first morning I walked in here. I just had no business trying to arrange things around it. She held his gaze for a moment. That's better, she said. And she picked up her hammer and went back to work, and he pulled up the spare stool near the doors and stayed until the light was gone, and that was the end of the argument and the beginning of something different between them, something with more ground under it than what had existed before. He came every week after that, sometimes more. What had existed between them before those 7 days, that careful unspoken thing, had acquired a new directness, as if the argument had moved them both past a threshold they had been approaching for months without naming. He did not declare anything. He was not the kind of man who made declarations of things that were still in process. But the quality of his presence had shifted, become less provisional, as if he had made a private decision and was now simply living according to it. He stayed longer on the evenings he came. They sat outside the forge when the weather allowed and inside when it did not, and they talked about things beyond the work, about the country they had both come from and the country they were in, about the kind of life worth building and the kind of person worth building it with. He told her about this land north of Silver Creek that he had been putting money toward for 3 years, a small holding in the foothills with good water and enough flat ground for a reasonable operation. He did not say what he intended to do with it. He described it carefully with attention to detail, wanting the listener to see it the way he saw it. She listened carefully. She was aware in the back of her mind that Aldous Crane had not moved on. She could feel it in the behavior of the town around her, in the light, careful quality of certain conversations, in the way Mayor Pruitt looked at her when she passed his office, as if he was carrying a thought he had not yet decided whether to share. She had not heard anything specific since Hattie's warning in late October. But the absence of movement was not the same as the absence of intention. And Rowena had grown up in a forge where you learned not to assume that a piece of metal had stopped being dangerous just because it had stopped glowing. She kept working. She kept watching. The harvest dance was held on the third Saturday of November. It was the social event of the KFAX year. The community hall cleared of its usual furniture and hung with lanterns the Beaumont boys brought in to play fiddle and guitar, the whole valley gathering in the particular relieved way of people who have made it through another year of hard work and want one evening of something that is not hard work. Rowena had not planned to attend. She had not attended the previous year's social events in KFAX because she had not been in KFAX the previous year. And she had not attended the social events of Harwick in the last several years because the social events of Harwick had a way of reminding her in specific and detailed ways of the gap between the woman she was and the woman a social event wanted her to be. But Aldous Crane had other plans. He found her at the forge on the Thursday before the dance and presented it as a generous gesture she could attend the harvest dance as a representative of the local business community, and in light of her situation, he would graciously arrange for her to help with the refreshment table as a way of participating in the community. As if this were a favor. As if being assigned to stand behind a table serving food to people who would dance past her all evening were an opportunity being extended rather than a position being imposed. She understood exactly what it was. She understood that Crane wanted her there in an apron visible, serving so that the people of Kfax could look at her and see a woman who had been put in her proper place. It would undo, in one public evening, the quiet work of the past 2 months. It would take everything she had built and reframe it visually and socially as something that fit inside the existing order after all. She thought about refusing, but refusing meant not attending, and not attending meant ceding the evening entirely. And something in her, the same something that had made her walk to the mayor's office with a forged key request instead of walking to the train station with a return ticket, was not willing to cede the evening. Fine, she told Crane. She spent Friday making a decision about what to wear. The community hall was lit from within when she arrived, warm, golden light spilling from the windows, and the sound of fiddles already going the particular lively energy of a community that has given itself permission to be happy for one evening. People were arriving in couples and family groups, the women in their good dresses and the men with their hair combed, everyone displaying the version of themselves they kept polished for public occasions. Rowena had not worn a dress in public in Kfax. She wore one that evening not because Crane had arranged for her to be there and not to satisfy anyone's expectation of what she should look like, but because she owned 2 dresses and one of them was plain brown cotton and the other was dark green wool that had been her mother's altered to fit Rowena's broader shoulders, and she had decided on the walkover that she would not be the version of herself that anyone expected tonight. She had not covered her arms. She had stood in the back room of the forge for a full 10 minutes, considering the long-sleeved shawl she could have pulled over the short-cuffed sleeves of the green dress. She had held it in her hands and thought about it carefully, the social calculation of it, the way covering her arms would make the evening easier, would make her less visible, would give people less to look at and comment on. Then she had put the shawl down and walked to the dance. The refreshment table was along the right wall, and Crane had indeed left an apron there with her name on a paper card beside it, and the woman already stationed there, Mrs. Holcomb, who ran the boarding house, looked at Rowena with the expression of someone waiting to see what happened next. Rowena picked up the apron. She was tying it on when the hall went slightly wrong, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the small social ripple of a crowd that has noticed something and is deciding how to react to it. She looked up. Wade Calloway was standing in the entrance of the community hall. He was not dressed differently than usual, not in the polished way of the men around him. He wore clean clothes and a clean hat, and he looked like what he was, a working man who had washed and combed his hair and come to the dance. He was looking around the room in the way a man looks around a room when he is looking for a specific person. His eyes found her. They found the apron. And something changed in his face, not dramatically, not with any theatrical emotion, but in the quiet, certain way of a man who has seen something and made a decision about it in the space of 2 seconds. He came across the room without hesitation, moving through the crowd directly without ceremony, his attention fixed on where he was going. He stopped in front of the refreshment table. He looked at her. He looked at the apron. He looked at the paper card with her name on it. "Take it off," he said, not loudly, quietly, just to her. "Wade, you came to the dance, Rowena." His voice was level, not angry, but carrying in it the kind of certainty that does not leave room for negotiation. "Not to serve it. Take it off." She looked at him for a moment across the table. He held out his hand, and she thought in the split second before she made the decision about everything this would mean. About Mrs. Whitmore, who was visible from here watching. About Aldous Crane, who was somewhere in this room. About the 30 or 40 people in this hall who would see exactly what it meant for Wade Calloway to cross the room and stand in front of Rowena Marsh and extend his hand. She untied the apron. She set it on the table. She came around from behind it and took his hand. He led her out to the floor as the fiddle changed to a waltz, and they moved into it together, and Rowena Marsh was dancing. She had not danced since she was a girl. Edmund had taught her in the kitchen of the Harwick house on winter evenings, humming the tune himself, because there was no music, and they danced anyway because he believed a person should know how. She had forgotten how much of it she still carried, how the body remembered what the mind let go of, how the muscle memory of movement came back when the music was right and the partner was steady. Wade was steady, not showy, not performing the dance for an audience, just present in it, leading with enough firmness to be useful and enough space for her to be herself in it, which was she was beginning to understand exactly how he did everything. She was aware of the room around them. She felt the watching, all the faces, the adjusting of opinions, the social recalibration happening in real time as the people of Kfax looked at Rowena Marsh dancing and tried to fit it into their existing understanding of who she was and where she belonged. She felt all of it, and she kept dancing. The waltz ended, and another began, and they danced that one too. Across the room, Mrs. Whitmore said something to the woman beside her, and the woman beside her turned to look, and Rowena met her gaze directly without apology, and the woman looked away first. Across the room, Aldous Crane stood near the far wall with a glass in his hand and an expression that was perfectly controlled in the way of a man controlling something that has surprised him, and he did not come near the dance floor for the rest of the evening. And Rowena Marsh danced. She danced in her mother's green wool dress, with her arms uncovered in the lantern light of the Kfax Community Hall, and she kept her chin up and her back straight, and she thought about her father who had taught her that you finish the work first, and then you feel what you feel. And she thought that the work of this evening was the dancing, and she was going to finish it properly. Between dances, Wade brought her cider and stood beside her and said very little, which was what she needed. The evening wound down slowly around them. People drifted toward the doors. The fiddle slowed. The lanterns cast longer shadows. When they finally stepped outside into the cold November night, Rowena stood on the steps of the community hall and breathed the cold air in and felt the specific, particular fullness of an evening that had gone the way you needed it to go, rather than the way it was arranged to go. Wade stood beside her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "Thank you," she said, "for coming across the room." "Thank you for taking the apron off," he said. She looked at him. "You knew I'd debate it." "I knew you'd think it through," he said. "That's different from debating." The smallest pause. "I trusted you'd make the right call." She was quiet at that. "I trusted you'd make the right call. Not I knew you'd need me. Not I came to rescue you. I trusted you. I came to offer and trusted you to decide." She stood in the cold November night outside the community hall in Kfax, California, and she felt the thin line of light from that door open slightly in her chest, widen a degree or two. She did not say anything about it, but she noticed it. The stars above Kfax were very bright that night, the mountain air having sharpened everything to clarity, and she stood there for a long moment before she was ready to walk back to the forge. There was still tomorrow. There was still Crane and the contract and the slowly returning work and the long road of proving herself to a town that had made its judgment early and would take time to revise it. All of that was still there. But so was this, the cold night air and the stars, and a man standing beside her who had crossed a room because he saw something wrong being done and trusted her to handle the correcting of it herself. She was beginning to understand that it mattered. The morning after the harvest dance, Kfax woke up and went about its business the way small towns always do, with the deliberate ordinariness of people who have witnessed something significant and are still deciding what to make of it. Rowena opened the forge at first light. She did not know what the evening had changed exactly. She knew something had changed. She had felt it in the room, in the particular quality of the watching, in the way the social atmosphere of the hall had shifted its weight subtly but perceptibly as she and Wade moved through that first waltz. Change in a small town did not announce itself. It moved slowly and visibly, leaving marks that only become visible after time has passed, and you look back at where things used to be. She built the fire and set her tools in order and waited for the day's work to arrive. It arrived, not in a flood, not in the sudden reversal of a town that had made up its mind and then changed it completely overnight. But by mid-morning, she had 2 ranch hands in the forge for horseshoeing, and by mid-afternoon, a third job had come in, a miner from the eastern camps who had heard from someone that the K-Fax smithy did reliable work at fair prices. He was not from K-Fax. He had no opinion about Rowena, except the one formed by watching her work, which was a favorable one. She took his money and thanked him and went back to the fire. Hattie came by at the end of the day and sat on the bench outside the forge doors, the way she had taken to doing on evenings when the news of the day felt like it needed sharing. "Mrs. Whitmore spoke to my mother this morning," Hattie said. Rowena waited. "She said that Mr. Calloway seemed like a serious young man." Rowena looked at her. "That is very nearly a compliment," Hattie said with a small smile that meant she understood exactly how significant it was. "From Mrs. Whitmore, directed in your general vicinity, that is very nearly a compliment." Rowena went back inside and banked the forge, but she was almost smiling when she did it. November moved into December with the patience of a season that has nowhere else to be. The work continued to grow. Not explosively, not in a way that required her to hire help, yet but steadily, reliably, in the way of a business that has passed through an uncertain period and come out the other side with its reputation intact. The ranch families who had quietly reduced their visits began quietly returning. New customers came from the outlying settlements. The quality of the work was consistent and the prices were fair, and these were in the end the things that mattered most to people who needed a smithy. Wade came every week, sometimes more. He stayed longer on the evenings he came. They sat outside the forge when the weather allowed and inside when it did not. And they talked about the country they had both come from and the country they were in, about the kind of life worth building and the kind of person worth building it with. He told her more about the land north of Silver Creek, the way the creek line ran along its eastern edge, the quality of the grass in late spring, the particular shelter the hill to the north provided against the worst of the winter storms. He spoke of it the way you speak of something that has become more than a piece of ground, something that has taken on meaning beyond its practical dimensions. She listened to all of it and stored it carefully. The summons came on a Tuesday morning in the second week of December. Not a legal summons, nothing so formal as that. A notice delivered by the land office clerk informing her that Aldous Crane had filed a formal complaint with the town council regarding the outstanding obligations of the mail-order bride agreement executed between himself and one Rowena Marsh of Harwick, Pennsylvania, and requesting that the council convene a public hearing to consider the matter of financial remedy. She read it twice at the forge door with the morning cold coming in around her. The amount cited was specific and exact: the cost of the rail ticket from Pennsylvania to California, the agency fees, the advance accommodation expenses, a sum that represented give or take 4 months of the forge's current revenue. Not an impossible sum, but large enough to matter, large enough to be a serious problem if the council found in Crane's favor. She folded the notice carefully and set it on the workbench. Then she went to Hattie. Hattie Jensen, it turned out, had a sharper legal mind than her position behind a hardware store counter suggested. She had grown up reading her father's business contracts and had opinions about the construction of agreements that she had never had much occasion to express until now. They sat at the Jensens' kitchen table that evening, with the notice between them and a pot of coffee getting on the stove. "The problem for Crane," Hattie said, turning the notice to read it again, "is what he did at the station." Rowena looked at her. "The agreement has obligations on both sides. You were obligated to arrive present yourself and fulfill the terms of the arrangement." Hattie set the paper down. "He was obligated to receive you, fulfill his stated representations, and conduct himself according to the terms of a good faith agreement. What he said on that platform in public in front of witnesses is a breach. He repudiated the agreement by his own conduct before you had any opportunity to fulfill yours. Can I prove what he said?" How many people were on that platform, Rowena thought back. The thin crowd of a mid-morning arrival. The woman who had gone still near the far end of the platform, the man in the canvas jacket, two others she could not place with certainty. Enough, she said. Hattie nodded slowly. You don't need a lawyer. What you need is to be very clear, very calm, and very exact about the sequence of events. You need to establish that the breach was his before any obligation of yours came due. She paused. And you need a witness. You, boss, Rowena said. I wasn't there. You heard what I told you about it within 24 hours of it happening, before either of us had any reason to think it would matter. Hattie was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. That's true, I did. They looked at each other across the kitchen table. I'll be there, Hattie said. Whatever you need. Rowena put her hand over Hattie's briefly and then took it back, which was as much as she allowed herself in the way of demonstrating what she felt. Thank you, she said. She told Wade about the hearing the following Thursday when he came in with 2 horses from Silver Creek. She told him plainly without drama, the way she told him most things as information as fact, as the current state of a situation that had not yet resolved itself. He listened the same way he always listened, with his full attention and without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. What do you need, he said, not what can I do, not I'll handle it, what do you need? One you don't already know, to give me, she said. He looked at her. I mean it, she said. Hattie will be there. I know what I'm going to say. I've thought it through. She went back to the horse she was working on. I just wanted you to know, because you should know, that's all. He said nothing for a moment. All right, and he said. She worked. He held the horse. They did not say anything else about it. The public hearing was held on a Friday afternoon in the second week of December in the main room of the land office, which was the largest indoor meeting space in Cowboy that was not a saloon or a church. It was more attended than Rowena had anticipated. The room held perhaps 30 people, ranchers and merchants and their wives, the kind of attendance that told you this had been discussed widely in the preceding days and that people had opinions about the outcome. Mayor Pruitt sat at the front table alongside the 2 council members, a ledger open before him, and an expression that suggested he found the whole business distasteful, but had not found a way to avoid it. Aldous Crane sat to the right with his hat on his knee and the look of a man who had arranged things to his satisfaction. Rowena sat to the left with her hands folded on the table in front of her. She had worn her good dress, not the green wool that was for evenings that she chose. She wore the brown wool plain and clean and serious, and her hair pulled back neatly, and she sat with her back straight and her hands still, and she let the room settle around her without showing anything on her face. She was aware of Wade in the back of the room. He had not told her he was coming. He was simply there standing along the back wall with his hat in his hands, and when she turned briefly and saw him, he gave her a single level nod that said everything he needed to say and nothing more. She turned back to the front. Crane presented his case first. He was composed, even gracious about it, presented himself as a man who had acted in good faith and had been left with an outstanding obligation by a woman who had arrived under a contract and then elected to disregard it. He cited the costs. He presented the receipts. He was careful not to say anything that could be directly challenged because he was above all a man experienced in managing his own image in public situations. When he finished, Mayor Pruitt looked at Rowena. Miss Marsh, he said, you have the floor. She stood. She did not have notes. She had thought about bringing them and decided against it. Notes suggested uncertainty, suggested a script, prepared in advance, suggested the possibility that the words might not be entirely her own. She stood with her hands at her sides, and she spoke from what she knew. On the 23rd of September, she said, I arrived at the Kfax Railroad Station at approximately 10:45 in the morning. I had traveled from Harwick, Pennsylvania under the terms of an agreement with Mr. Crane that specified I was to present myself to him upon arrival, and that he was to receive me in good faith and according to the representations made in the agreement and in his correspondence. She paused. Before I had crossed the length of the platform, before I had spoken a single word to Mr. Crane or he to me, before any obligation of mine under the agreement had come due, Mr. Crane stated in a voice audible to multiple people present that I was, and I am quoting, precisely not what he ordered. He then, in the same public setting, referred to me in terms that made clear he was refusing the agreement based solely on my physical appearance. She looked directly at Crane. A mail-order bride agreement is a contract. Contracts carry obligations on both parties. The obligation to present myself in good faith was mine. The obligation to receive me in good faith was his. He refused that obligation publicly in front of witnesses before I had any opportunity to fulfill mine. She looked back at the counsel. A man cannot walk away from his end of a bargain and then collect damages from the other party for not performing under an agreement he already refused. The room was quiet. I have a witness, Rowena said, who can attest to my account of the events at the station, having heard it from me within 24 hours of the occurrence. Mayor Pruitt looked at Hattie Jensen, who was sitting in the front row with her hands folded and her chin up. I can confirm Miss Marsh's account of what occurred, Hattie said steadily. She described it to me in detail the following morning before there was any reason to think the account would ever need to be documented. Pruitt looked at the council members beside him. He looked at Crane, he looked at Rowena, then he looked at the room. The room had been doing its own calculus while she spoke. She could see it in the faces, the ranchers and merchants running the logic of it, the fairness of it, the plain sequence of events. These were people who lived and died by the terms of agreements. They understood contracts. They understood breach. And they understood from the plain telling of it what had happened on that platform and who had broken what first. Mr. Briggs, whose wagon axle Rowena had repaired 2 months ago, who had stood at the forge door afterward and shaken her hand and said it was the best work he'd had done in 3 years, was sitting in the third row. He leaned forward slightly and said not loudly but clearly enough to carry "That's fair." 2 people near him nodded. Aldous Crane looked at the room and understood what was happening. Whatever he had imagined this afternoon would accomplish, it was not accomplishing it. The faces around him were not the faces of people deciding in his favor. They were the faces of people who had listened to a plain telling of events and were applying the same standards they applied to everything else in their lives, the standards of fairness and sequence and the honoring of obligations on both sides. Mayor Pruitt closed the ledger. "The way I read it," he said in the deliberate, unadorned voice of a man who had been making practical judgments for 30 years, Mr. Crane broke this agreement before Miss Marsh had any chance to fulfill her end of it. You cannot walk away from a bargain and then collect on it. He looked at Crane for one level, unhurried moment. This matter is closed. Crane stood. He put on his hat. He walked out of the room without looking at anyone, and the door closed behind him with a sound that was exactly as final as everything that had just happened. Rowena stood at the table and let the room breathe around her. Several people stood. Mr. Briggs was one of the first. He crossed the room and shook her hand without a word, which was the form of respect that meant the most. 2 of the ranching wives, who had never spoken to her directly, came forward and introduced themselves, which was something. Hattie appeared at her side and took her arm briefly, and that too. She was aware at the back of the room of Wade Calloway watching. She turned once and looked at him. He was not smiling. He was simply looking at her directly, steadily, with the same expression he had worn in the forge on the first morning when he had watched her work and found it good. The same expression now directed not at the horseshoe she had shaped, but at what she had just done in a room full of people with a case made of nothing but the truth and the clear-eyed telling of it. She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned back to the people around her, because there were hands to shake and names to learn, and a community that was at this moment in the process of deciding to include her in itself. She finished the work. He found her an hour later. The room had emptied gradually the way rooms empty. After something significant has happened, people needing to go home and think about what they had witnessed to adjust it into their understanding of the town and the people in it. Rowena had stayed until the last of them had gone, speaking with Mayor Pruitt briefly about nothing in particular, which was his way of acknowledging that he had seen what she had done and considered it well done. Then she walked out into the cold December afternoon. Wade was waiting at the edge of the street. He had not gone in with the crowd. He was standing the way he always stood when he was waiting for something, not restless, not impatient, just present his attention on the door. They walked without deciding to walk. East on the main street, then north on the road that climbed gradually out of the town toward the open country, the foothills rising on either side, and the mountains beyond them going white at the top in the early winter cold. The light was that particular low December light that comes in at an angle and makes everything look more itself than it usually does, but sharper, cleaner, without the softening of summer. They walked for perhaps a mile without speaking. The road curved north and then east, and Wade turned off it onto a track that Rowena had not been on before, a rough path that climbed the shoulder of a low hill through dry grass and winter scrub. She followed without asking where they were going. She had learned that Wade did not take you somewhere without a reason. They came to the top of the hill. The valley spread below them, Silver Creek winding through it, the town of Cowboys small and orderly in the middle distance, the Sierra Nevada rising enormous and white to the east. The light was going now, the sun dropping toward the western ridges, and the sky had taken on the particular cold clarity of a December evening, at altitude every color sharp and true. Wade stopped. He was looking out at the valley and specifically at the land below them on the northern slope, a stretch of meadow ground with good grass and a reliable creek line running through it, protected from the worst weather by the hill they stood on. "This is it," he said. She looked at it. 6 years, he said. 3 ranches, 4 cattle, drives every dollar I could put aside. He was quiet for a moment. "I bought it in August. Before, he paused. Before I rode into Kfax with a horse that needed a shoe." She looked at him. "I had been working toward it for so long that when I finally had it, I didn't know what to do with it," he said. "It was just land, a piece of ground. I had been telling myself for 6 years that having it was what I was working for, and then I had it, and I stood here on this hill and thought, what is this for, exactly? What is any of it for if there's nobody to build it with?" The light was almost gone, the valley settling into early dusk below them, the first stars beginning to appear at the eastern edge of the sky. "Then I rode into town on a Thursday morning with a horse that had thrown a shoe," he said, "and I watched a woman work iron the way my father taught me to watch good work. And I thought, there she is, that's what it's for." Rowena stood very still. Wade was quiet for a long moment before he spoke again. When he did, he looked out at the valley rather than at her, the way a man looks away when he is about to say something he has been carrying a long time and is finally setting down. "I need to tell you something," he said, "before anything else." She waited. "Crane can't write, not well enough to manage real correspondence. He can sign his name and make out a basic bill of sale, and that's most of it." Wade's voice was level, but there was something careful in it, the care of a man who understands that the words he's choosing matter. "He hired me to handle his written accounts a couple of years back. Business correspondence, supplier orders, contracts. He paid me extra for it, and I did the work." Rowena felt something shift in the air between them. "When the agency advertisement came back with a reply, your reply, he handed it to me and told me to respond. Said to write something that would close the deal." He paused. "He gave me no other instructions. He never read what I wrote. He just signed the letters I put in front of him." She was very still. "I wrote every letter you received," Wade said. "Every word about the California light, about the Sierra Nevada in spring, about what I respected in a person, about strength." He finally looked at her. His gray blue eyes were direct, holding hers without flinching. "I wrote what I believed, what I had always believed before I had any reason to believe it about a specific person. He never read them. He wouldn't have understood most of it if he had." The valley lay below them in the December dusk. "The man you are coming to meet," Wade said quietly, "was never Aldous Crane." Rowena stood with that for a long time. She thought about those letters, the handwriting that was sometimes uneven but always deliberate, as if the author chose each word slowly and meant it fully. The specific love of the California light in the foothills. The words about strength in a woman being a quality to be valued, that a man who thought otherwise was a fool. She had read them so many times she could recite passages from memory. She had been right about the letters. She had simply been wrong about who wrote them. She thought about the morning Wade had first walked into her forge, the way he had stood and watched her work. The lack of surprise in him, the complete absence of the look she had cataloged and learned to expect. The way he had said strong is beautiful on you, as if he had always known it and was only now having occasion to say it out loud. She looked at him. "You wrote that I was exactly what you were looking for," she said. "Yes," Wade said. "I did. And then I arrived. And then you arrived." Something moved in his expression, something that had been waiting a long time to be said. "And you were." The silence between them was not the silence of an argument or an accusation. It was the silence of two people sitting with a truth that had needed time to reach them. "Why didn't you tell me before?" she said. It was not quite a question. "Because for a long time you needed to know that you could stand here on your own," he said. "Because the forge and the hearing and everything you built here, that couldn't come from me, that had to be yours. If I had told you earlier, it would have tangled everything up." He paused. "And because I was afraid you'd leave." She looked at him for a long moment. "You could have left too," she said, when it was clear what Crane had done at the station. "You could have walked away and nobody would have faulted you for it." "I know," he said simply. She thought about that. A man who had written letters in good faith to a woman he had never met, describing what he believed, what he valued, and then had watched that woman arrive and be humiliated by the person whose name was on the outside of the envelope. A man who had chosen to stay close to watch, to help in the one way he knew was the right way to help. Not by rescuing, not by arranging, but by seeing, by believing. "I love you, Rowena," he said. He turned to look at her directly with the same clear, unhurried attention he gave to everything he considered worth his full regard. "Not in spite of your strength, not despite who you are and what you can do and the way you take up space in a room without apologizing for it. Because of it. Every bit of it. I have believed that since before you existed to me as a real person. And then you came and you were more than anything I had written toward." The last light caught the meadow below them, turning the winter grass briefly gold. "I want to build something here," Wade said. "With you. Not for you, not instead of you, with you. Your forge, your work, your name on the door, as long as you want it there. I want us to build it together on equal ground, and I want to do it with the woman who walked into a hearing room today with nothing but the truth and walked out with everything she was owed." He stopped. He did not reach for her hand. He did not step closer. He stood where he was and let everything he had said exist in the air between them, and he waited for her to do with it what she chose. Rowena was quiet for a long time, not because she did not know what she felt. She knew exactly what she felt. She had known it for weeks, had carried it the way you carry something valuable that you are not sure yet how to set down properly. The feeling itself was not the question. The question was what she would do with it and from what position and why. She had come to California as a woman who needed a way out. She had come under a contract that treated her future as a transaction, and the transaction had failed before it began, and she had made her own way from the wreckage of it. She had built something here, not because a man offered it to her, not because the circumstances left her no choice, but because she had chosen to build it with her own hands from what was available. That was different from how she had arrived. She understood, standing on that hill in the last of the December light, that the difference mattered enormously. Not for pride's sake, for truth's sake. She was not the same person who had read an advertisement at a boarding house table in Harwick and bought a ticket because there was nothing left to stay for. She was someone who had stayed in a town that rejected her and made it change its mind. She was someone who had stood in a room that afternoon and defended herself with nothing but the clear telling of what had happened and won. She was someone who could walk away from this hill and be all right. She could walk back to the forge and work and build her life here on her own terms and be not happy exactly. Not the specific happiness she was aware of when Wade was in the room, but whole, self-sufficient, hers. The fact that she did not need this was, she realized, exactly why she was free to want it. She turned to look at him. "I came here to become someone's wife," she said, "and nearly lost myself before I got the chance. And then I didn't lose myself. I found out more clearly who I was than I had ever known before because I had to, because there was no one else to do it for me." She paused. "I need you to understand that. I need you to understand that I am choosing this from a place where I know who I am and what I can do without it." "I know," he said. "I'm not choosing you because I need you," she said. "I'm choosing you because I want you. Because you watched me work on the first morning without looking away. Because when you wrote that, strong was beautiful, you meant it the way my father meant the things he said because it was true, and you saw no point in pretending otherwise." She looked at him steadily. "Because you crossed a room at a dance and held about your hand and then trusted me to decide whether to take it." The stars were coming in fully now, the mountains dark against the deep blue of the evening sky to the east. "There is a difference," she said, "between choosing someone because you need them and choosing someone because you want them. The first is fear. The second is something else. What is it? He asked quietly. It's what I'm doing, she said, and she crossed the distance between them. They were married on a Saturday in late January on the hill above the valley in a ceremony, as plain as both of them. The circuit preacher who came through KFAX every 6 weeks, Hattie Jensen standing up for Rowena, two of Wade's friends from Silver Creek standing up for him. The mountains were white to the east, and the valley below was winter brown, and the sky was the clear hard blue of a California January morning. Rowena wore the green wool dress and left her arms uncovered. There was no audience. They had not invited the town, which was not a statement about the town, but a statement about what the day was for. This was theirs. The town could have the version that came after the settled, ordinary daily version of a life being built together. The beginning was private. She kept the forge. This was not a negotiation. It was simply how it was from the first day of the marriage to the last. Wade moved from the Silver Creek bunkhouse to the land on the hill, and they built a house there through the spring. A practical, well-constructed house with a proper kitchen and enough rooms for what they planned to build toward, and he made the ride into KFAX with her every morning and home every evening, and neither of them considered any other arrangement because there was no other arrangement that would have been true to who either of them was. Wade left Silver Creek in the spring and took up the land full-time building, the operation slowly and carefully the way he did everything. The horses he raised were good stock, well-trained, and the word got around the foothills the way good work always does. The forge was his wife's business in the way that the ranch was his separate operations equally respected the earnings of each going into the same ledger that neither of them kept secrets from. The town of KFAX adjusted itself the way small towns adjust when the social order has been revised by events too clear to ignore. Mrs. Whitmore declared that Mr. Calloway had chosen very sensibly, which was the closest she was capable of coming to an apology. And Rowena accepted it in the spirit in which it was offered, which was the spirit of a woman who understood that getting the future right mattered more than making the past admit its errors. Aldous Crane left KFAX in the spring of 1884, reportedly to take up a business interest in Sacramento. Nobody said much about his leaving. Some doors, when they close quietly. The years came in seasons. Their first child, a daughter they named Clara after no one in particular, but because the name felt right, arrived in the winter of 1885. She had Wade's gray-blue eyes and Rowena's wide shoulders in a temperament that combined the best of both, deliberate like her father, direct, like her mother, entirely her own self from the beginning. 5 more followed over the next decade. 2 boys and 3 girls, each of them raised in a house where the work of both parents was equally visible and equally valued, where the forge was as ordinary a part of the landscape as the cattle pasture, where strength, physical morale, the kind that holds you upright when the wind is against you, was spoken of as a gift and not an embarrassment. Rowena trained her first female apprentice in 1888. The girl's name was May Thornton, 16 years old, daughter of a miner's family from the eastern camps, who showed up at the forge door one April morning and said she wanted to learn the trade. Rowena looked at her hands, already showing the early calluses of a girl who had been doing physical work since she could walk, and hired her on the spot. She did not hire May as a favor or a gesture. She hired her because the hands told the truth about the aptitude, and Rowena had been taught that any skill worth having was worth teaching properly to whoever had the aptitude to receive it. She taught May everything Edmund Marsh had taught her, without shortcuts, without omissions, without the condescension of someone imparting knowledge they expect to be only partially absorbed. May Thornton absorbed all of it. She opened her own smithy in a town 12 miles north in 1894 at the age of 22. She trained 2 apprentices of her own before the decade was out, and both of them went on to open their own shops. The knowledge passed forward and spread the way useful things spread when they are no longer being held in one place. 3 more women came through Rowena's forge in the years that followed. Each of them learned the trade completely. Each of them went on. The seasons turned. The children grew and left and came back with children of their own. The ranch expanded modestly, 1 parcel at a time, and the forge expanded modestly too, taking on an apprentice every few years as the surrounding territory grew, and the demand for good smithing work grew with it. Wade handled the ranch the way he handled everything, with patience, with attention, with the steady accumulation of small good decisions that add up over time to something solid. They grew old on the land above the valley in the house they had built together with the forge at the edge of it and the mountains visible from every east-facing window. They grew old the way good work ages, not by diminishing, but by becoming more fully itself, all the unnecessary things worn away, the essential things made plain. On evenings when the work was done, they sat on the porch and watched the light change over the valley. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they sat in the comfortable silence of two people who no longer needed words to communicate what mattered. They had grown into each other the way two trees grow in proximity, separately rooted, separately themselves but shaped by the years of close presence into something that would not look quite right apart. Wade's hair went gray at the temples in his mid-30s and then gray throughout, which suited him. And Rowena's went from dark blonde to silver blonde in a way that made her look, as Wade told her regularly, like she had been forged from something fine and come out shining. He said it the way he said everything he meant, simply directly, as a fact that he saw no reason not to name. She had learned over the years to believe him, not just to hear the words and receive them as kindness, but to actually believe them, to look at herself the way he looked at her and understand that what he saw was real, that the assessment was accurate, that she was not a woman who needed to apologize for what she was. That had taken longer than falling in love had. It was harder work. But it was the most important work she did in those years, and she did it the way she did everything, completely, without shortcuts, until it was done properly. Their grandchildren came in ones and twos over the years. Clara's children, and then the children of their sons, and eventually the children of those children. The house that Wade had built from a single story to 2 stories to accommodate the expanding family was full on holidays, voices and feet, and the particular noisy warmth of a family that has been taught to take pleasure in one another's company. Rowena presided over these gatherings from the center of them, not from any throne or seat of honor, but from the kitchen, from the porch, from wherever the work happened to be happening, because she had never learned to be comfortable in a room where she was not doing something useful. Wade died in the spring of 1927 in his sleep on a clear morning when the valley was just beginning to go green. He had been 69 years old. He had worked the land until the year before, when his body had finally registered its objections to 60 years of hard use, and even then he had done what he could manage and left the rest to their youngest son, who had grown up on the land and loved it the way his father had loved it. In those last months, Wade had spent his afternoons on the porch, watching the cattle pasture and the mountains, drinking coffee, occasionally offering advice that was sought, and occasionally advice that was not, which their youngest son accepted with the patience of a man who understood that some things you do for a person because you love them. Rowena sat beside him through the last days as she had sat beside her father through his, the same steadiness, the same willingness to be present for what was happening without looking away from it. She held his hand, which was still rough and broad, even now, a hand that had spent its life in honest work, and she did not look away. She did not fall apart after. She had loved him completely for 43 years, with the full force of a nature that did not do anything halfway. She had built her life with him and raised her children alongside him and grown into the person she was in no small part because of the specific quality of his belief in her, the particular unshowy, consistent belief of a man who had seen her clearly on the first morning, who had written toward her before he knew her face, who had never in 4 decades looked away or revised his assessment. She grieved him the way she did everything completely, without pretending otherwise, and then she got up and went to work. The forge was still running. Her granddaughter Clara's oldest girl had been working it for 3 years now, learning the trade the way Rowena had learned it, by doing from someone who knew it fully without shortcuts. Rowena was too old for the heavy work, but not too old to teach. And teaching turned out to be its own form of the work, the knowledge passing forward through the hands of the next generation, the same knowledge Edmund Marsh had passed into hers on winter mornings in Harwick, Pennsylvania, more than 40 years before. She worked until she was 76. Then her body finally made clear, in the way that bodies eventually make things clear, that the heavy work was finished. She moved into the smaller room at the back of the house that caught the eastern light in the morning, and she sat in the chair by the window and watched the mountains, and she let her children and grandchildren come and go around her steadily without grasping, trusting the current. She died in the fall of 1940 in the same chair, by the same window, on a morning when the aspen leaves on the hillside below the Sierra Nevada had just gone gold. She was 79 years old. She was buried next to Wade in the cemetery at the edge of Kfax, under the shadow of the mountains they had both loved. The service was attended by 6 children, 14 grandchildren, 3 great-grandchildren, 4 female blacksmiths who had learned their trade through a lineage that led back to her forge in most of the town of Kfax, which had long since made its peace with having been wrong about her and was not in the habit of talking about it. The headstone was simple. It read Rowena Marsh Calloway, 1861-1940, beloved wife, mother, and blacksmith, strong and beautiful. The forge on the edge of the Calloway land still operated the year she died and for many years after. The work changed as the century changed, different machines, different needs, different materials coming through the doors. But the fundamentals held the way fundamentals always hold: fire and iron and the knowledge of how to bring one to bear on the other. The weight of the hammer finding the right angle, the way you know by the color what the metal needs and what it can bear. Rowena's great-granddaughter was working the forge in 1940. Her hands were broad and strong, the calluses in the right places, the movements unhurried and exact. She worked from before first light and kept working until the day's jobs were done, and she said what needed saying and nothing more, and she carried herself with the straight-back steadiness of someone who knows how to be where they are and does not require the world's permission to be there. Strong people said of her. The word meant something different in Kfax by then than it had in 1883. It had been wearing a different meaning for Amalgamatheim. It had meant something different since a woman arrived at a train station in September of that year, heard what a man said about her, picked up her case, and walked in a direction that was not toward him. Since a girl from Pennsylvania stood in a borrowed forge before dawn and put hammer to iron while a town decided what to make of her. Since a cowboy with gray-blue eyes watched that work and said 6 words that were true and simple and entirely meant. Strong is beautiful on you. They were still true. They would keep being true. The forge fire held its heat in the early morning, and the iron came to temperature the way it always did, slowly, fully without apology, and the mountains rose white and enormous against the eastern sky, and the work went on. As it always had, as it always would.